Orcus in astrology. What is Orcus? What does it represent? Why should you care? How can you use it? Let's find out. I will go over the astronomy, the mythology, and the astrology of Orcus. Both the astronomy and mythology of a god or deity gives us great insight into the characteristics of a planet or minor planet and helps to shape its astrology. So that being said, let's start with the astronomy. Orcus was discovered on February 17th, 2004 by Mike Brown, Chad Trujillo, and David Rabinowitz. Moving out from the sun, past the asteroid belt, past the gas giants, just outside Neptune's orbit, lies the trans-Neptunian objects. And here we find Orcus. A trans-Neptunian object is any dwarf planet or minor planet in the solar system that orbits the sun at a greater average distance than Neptune, which has a semi-major axis of 30.1 astronomical units. Simply put, it's any planet or minor planet or asteroid outside of Neptune's orbit. There are many TNOs, trans-Neptunian objects, but some of the largest and well-known include Pluto, Eris, Haumea, Makemake, Gongong, Quaoar, Ixion, Sedna, and of course, Orcus. TNOs can be further broken down into subcategories, the main ones being the Kuiper belt, the scattered disk, and the detached objects. The Kuiper belt can be broken down into classical objects, also called cubanos, and resonant objects, which is what Orcus is. It is a resonant Kuiper belt object. This image is excellent. It shows the Kuiper belt with the resonant objects in red and the classical in blue, as well as showing the scattered disk and the locations of Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, as well as the centaurs in yellow. I recommend saving this image. I'll link it below for a good overview of the locations of the outer solar system, the different bodies out there. I mentioned resonant Kuiper belt objects, and Orcus is classified as one. And all this is it's located in the Kuiper belt, so it's a Kuiper belt object, and it has a 2 to 3 resonance with Neptune, which is why it's called a resonant object. Just know that Orcus has a 2 to 3 resonance with Neptune. This is the same as Pluto, which makes Orcus a Plutino. This is a name for any Kuiper belt object in a 2 to 3 resonance with Neptune. All of these names are just about classification. They help us to better understand the outer solar system, and in turn our psyche in astrology. A resonant Kuiper belt object is any TNO in mean motion resonance with Neptune. This happens at different intervals, like X and Y. So like 1 to 1, which is the Neptune Trojans, they basically orbit for every 1 rotation that Neptune makes around the sun. They also make 1 rotation, which makes sense because the Trojans sit on Neptune's orbital path. You also have 1 to 2, 2 to 3, which is the Plutinos. So what that means is for every 3 rotations of Neptune around the sun, the Plutinos make 2. Or you could look at it as for every 1.5 rotations of Neptune, the Plutinos make 1 rotation. And then you also have 3 to 5, 4 to 7, etc. And also, Orcus is a potential dwarf planet. It has not been classified as one yet, but with further study, it most likely will be. It fits the criteria for a dwarf planet. The main difference between a dwarf planet and a main planet is that a dwarf planet has not cleared its orbit of other bodies. And you can see this in the asteroid belt and in the Kuiper belt, where there's many bodies there, and Ceres is one of them. The current 5 dwarf planets that are classified as dwarf planets are Ceres, Pluto, Makemake, Haumea, and Eris. But as I said, there are quite a few TNOs which are considered potential dwarf planets. For now, Orcus is a minor planet TNO. A minor planet is all of the celestial bodies that are not planets or dwarf planets. All the asteroids, the centaurs, TNOs, etc. That is the breakdown of the planet classes. You have the main planets, dwarf planets, and then minor planets. All right, moving on to some boring information. Orcus has an orbital period of 245.2 years. all the Plutinos hover around the 247-year orbital period, give or take a couple of years. And as such, they all return together in astrology. And this adds to the idea that Plutinos are all related and represent the subconscious mind. More on that idea later. Orcus has an aphelion of 48.067 astronomical units and a perihelion of 30.281 astronomical units. These are the furthest and closest it gets to the sun, respectively. And it also has a semi-major axis of 39.174 astronomical units. As we can see here, Orcus orbits firmly in the Kuiper belt, which spans from about 30.1 AU outside Neptune's orbit to about 50 AU, which is where something called the Kuiper cliff resides, a sudden fall-off in the number of minor planets. Astronomers are unsure of exactly why this happens, but just past this is the scattered disk. For reference, dwarf planet Eris resides in the scattered disk. All right, we got through the boring physical stuff. Let's look at some more. Nice. Orcus has an eccentricity of 0.227. It has an inclination of 20.592 degrees. It has an albedo of 21 to 25% and a size of roughly 595.5 miles in diameter. So eccentricity is how stretched out the orbit is, and from a circle. A perfect circle will have an eccentricity of 0. And as you move up to 1, it stretches out into an elliptical shape more and more in a more stretched out orbit, up to the point where at 1, and this, as this diagram shows, then you reach a parabola and you have an open space and you don't have a continuous orbit. And an example of that would be something like Oumuamua, which came into our system and then left on a hyperbolic trajectory. The planets and the minor planets do not orbit in a parabola shape. So the highest eccentricity that you can have is 0.999999999. Because the moment you reach a number of 1, then you don't have an orbit around a body. So just for reference sake, so like if you see a planet has an eccentricity on paper of like, say, 0.5, you'll know that it's pretty stretched out. It's going to have a pretty elliptical orbit versus something like that has like maybe 0.1. It's going to be a lot more circular. Inclination, on the other hand, is the tilt off of the ecliptic axis. So when you look at the planets, they all kind of are on the same plane. Basically, they all rotate around the same plane. How tilted off of that axis, using our handy protractor here, we can see that Orcus is tilted pretty far. The technical number is 20.592 degrees, so 20.5 degrees. On our protractor, it's not perfect. Obviously, this isn't precise visual science, but you get the point of what inclination is. It's how far off of the blue you can see is where the other planets orbit, which is the ecliptic, how far off or how high or low it orbits. And so visually, that's what the inclination means. So eccentricity is how stretched out the orbit is. Inclination is the tilt. Then we have albedo, which simply put is the brightness. That isn't the technical thing. It's how much it reflects white light, and it has to do with that. But basically, simply put, it's how bright a planet looks to the eye. So or to a telescope. So for example, like an albedo, a really low one will be very dark and it won't reflect much of the sun's light. So it's going to be harder to see. Orcus has an albedo of about 21 to 25%. It's also expressed in the decimal form, so like 0.21 to 0.25. Basically, that just tells us that it's pretty dim compared to some other planets like Pluto, Eris. They're pretty bright. They have pretty high albedos comparatively. This chart here shows the different albedos of the main planets in the solar system, and as well as Enceladus. And we can see it has a very, very high albedo, and that's basically because it's composed on the outer surface. It's clean ice, and obviously that's going to be very reflective of light. Now, Venus has also a very high one, which makes sense. We can see Venus very brightly in the night sky, the morning star, of course, or the evening star, and as well as Jupiter has a pretty high one. Jupiter's size also attributes to how easy it is to see. So the things like the albedo, the brightness, the size, and how close the planet is to Earth all add to how easy it is for us to see with our physical eyes, which is a part of what initially started astrology. So then finally we have this size of Orcus, which this picture shows Orcus next to the Earth and our moon, Luna. And obviously Orcus is very small, relatively, but again, it is actually, and then in the next picture here, we can see it's actually one of the larger Kuiper Belt objects and larger Plutinos. And so, I mean, besides Pluto, it's one of the larger objects in the Kuiper Belt. And finally, just with the astronomy of Orcus, it has one known moon called Vanth. And Vanth is named for the Etruscan daemona who escorted souls to the underworld. So I briefly just mentioned this, but I'm going to go deeper into it. But why do we care about all of this astronomy as astrologers? Well, beyond giving us a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of our psyche, the as above, so below, the physical characteristics also give rise to astrology in the first place, which I mentioned. In modern times, we can get far more detailed in our observations and understanding of the planets and other minor planets. And this is why physical characteristics are important. They give us just as much insight into the astrology as mythology. The more we learn about the physical characteristics of the planets, the more that story, so to speak, helps us understand astrology and then our own psyche better. All right, let's look at some mythology. There are definitely not as many stories and myths involving Orcus as there are other gods in either Greek or Roman. But known as Orcus in Etruscan and Roman, and known as Orcus in Greek, Orcus was a personified spirit or daemon in ancient times. He was a son of Eris, who also gave birth to the Furies. The personified spirits or concepts in ancient Greek mythology represented specific concepts or parts of oneself and our experience of life, the specific parts of our psyche, as opposed to the gods and planets, which represent broader and more important parts of our psyche. Orcus was considered a god of the underworld, not the ruler, who is Hades, Pluto, but one of the other gods who has to do more with the concept relating to the underworld, or in modern parlance, a part of our subconscious mind. The subconscious mind, or better put, the underworld, hell, Hades, whatever you call it, in many different mythologies and many different cultures, they all have an area, a dark area, a place where the dead is. And archetypally speaking, metaphorically speaking, in our mind, if you want to relate that to our mind, it is the subconscious. It is the part of the mind that is active, but we aren't aware of. And it influences us, it affects us, but we aren't consciously aware of. And many stories involve heroes going into the underworld to then come back out. And that in modern parlance and psychological or astrological parlance means going into the subconscious of the mind and coming back out. And we can talk about, that involves the hero's journey, the idea of like, whether you look at Jung or like modern Jordan Peterson, the idea of the dragon in the subconscious, and you battle the dragon. Pluto rules the main monsters in our subconscious, quote unquote, the dragons in our subconscious. Orcus represents the path, the understanding and the knowledge, the truth that we wish to express, and also how then we go about coming out of the underworld. Orcus was the personified spirit of oaths, and more specifically, the curse that would be inflicted upon anyone who swore a false oath. He was the punitive companion of Dike, or justice. This shows the more noble and good intentions of Orcus. Orcus only punished those who broke an oath, no one else. He was lesser known and a humbler deity than Hades, for example. While Hades had many more dramatic and intense experiences in mythologies and stories, and is connected to many more gods or parts of our psyche, Orcus is more specific in his role, and so doesn't come up as much in astrology, but when he does, it's very specific and important and powerful at the same time. Despite being just one more child of Eris who gave birth to some of the worst parts of humankind, he was still more powerful than all of those parts. And that shows the power of when we talk about the truth. We're talking about the truth inside ourselves, not just like the objective truth outside. We're talking about not lying to oneself, being true to oneself, being true to one's soul's purpose and path. That can have very strong effects on an individual, both negative and positive. As I mentioned, Orcus was born from Eris, who also were the Furies. The Furies are gods of vengeance. They embody all of the bad human experiences. Released by Pandora, Furies would attach themselves to malefactors' heels and would be seen as a personification of a bad conscience. This was the ancient way of describing human qualities such as rage, anger, hatred, lies, ruthlessness, etc. Orcus is not a Fury per se, but has more power than any of them, and acts in a similar way on the human psyche. Orcus also attaches to the malefactor's heels, and is the guilty conscience writ large. Alright, let's read some Orcus myths. The better path is to go by on the other side, towards justice. For justice beats outrage when she comes at the length to the end of the race. But only when he has suffered does the fool learn this. For Orcus, oath, keeps pace with wrong judgments. I mean, we can clearly see there that, you can't escape. When you lie, when you break an oath, you can't escape. And even the ancient Greeks knew this. And I think this is just, again, to stress the importance of the truth. And, in modern psychological parlance, astrological parlance, it's the truth in ourselves and not ignoring that truth and not lying to oneself, not lying to others. Glaucus journeyed to Delphi to question the oracle. When he asked the oracle whether he should seize the money under oath, that is, money entrusted to him which he had sworn to return, basically steal it, the Pythian priestess threatened him in these verses. Glaucus, it is more profitable now to prevail by your oath and seize the money. Swear, for death awaits even the man who swears true. But Orcus, has a son, nameless. He is without hands or feet, and he pursues swiftly, until he catches and destroys all the family and the entire house. The line of a man who swears true is better later on. When Glaucus heard this, he entreated the god to pardon him for what he had said. And the priestess answered that to tempt the god and to do the deed had the same effect. And I think this just kind of emphasizes how important it is to not lie, to not break oath, to not go back on one's word. And the idea that even to tempt it is as bad. And you'll see this later in religions as well, in religious texts. And finally, my favorite, the Aesop's Fables. A certain man took a deposit from a friend, but intended to keep it for himself. When the depositor then summoned him to swear an oath regarding the deposit, he realized the danger he was in and prepared to leave the city and go to his farm. When he reached the city gates, he saw a lame man who was also on his way out of town. He asked the man who he was and where he was going. The man said that he was the god named Orcus, and that he was on his way back to track down wicked people. The man then asked Orcus how often he revisited this city, and Orcus replied, I come back after about 40 years, or sometimes 30. Accordingly, on the very next day, the man did not hesitate to swear an oath that he had never received the deposit, which was a lie, and the man ran into Orcus, who dragged him off to the edge of a cliff. The man asked Orcus how he could have said that he wasn't coming back for another 30 years, when in fact he didn't even grant him a single day's reprieve. Orcus explained, You also need to know that if somebody intends to provoke me, I am accustomed to come back again the very same day. And again, this is just vitally important. I love Aesop's Fables because they show the importance of it's, you could lie and get away with it for a while, or you can go and lie and be punished the very next day. And it's the warning about, or break an oath and get away with it or not. But ultimately you will be punished. And that also goes back to the other myth with Glaucus. It's this idea that the line of, your family will be harmed. It's really to emphasize how damaging it is to oneself, one's psyche, and one's soul. The astrology of Orcus is still quite new. We have had only 16 years to work with this minor planet. More is to be learned about Orcus in astrology. But for now, here's what we know. Fundamentally, Orcus represents the truth, the hidden truth, uncomfortable truths, the truths you hide from yourself and others, both individual truths and collective truths. Truths that cannot be unlearned, truths that cannot be refuted, not factual truths, those are Mercury, Mercury can argue both sides of something, and not the hard truths of the reality that's represented by Saturn. No, the deeper spiritual truths, those are Orcus. Deeper truths related to soul growth and to subconscious forces within the individual and throughout the collective. Orcus is the deepest truths of our subconscious, the ethical battle within oneself, spiritual honesty, sticking to one's word, and also broken promises, and lies to others or oneself. When we lie to ourselves or others, we trap mental energy in the subconscious. We push things down and rationalize them away. They don't go away. The subconscious is the parts of us that we are not aware of or that we do not want to acknowledge. Pluto is the monster in our closet, so to speak, the monster in our subconscious, the things that have the most power over us, our deepest fears, but also our deepest powers. When we begin to understand our Pluto, we can start to take on the power it provides and not give that power away to others. This is why Pluto has to do with manipulation. If you don't have any emotional triggers, so to speak, then someone cannot control or manipulate you or hurt you. Our triggers are the things in our subconscious that we don't want to look at or are not aware of. Why does Pluto matter? I'm speaking of Orcus, I thought. Well, Orcus, also being a Plutino, as I mentioned earlier, is a part of the subconscious. Orcus is the anti-Pluto, and as such offers a solution to the negatives of Pluto, so to speak. They are complementary but different forces. Pluto and Orcus have opposite but similar orbits, and due to them both having 2-3 resonance with Neptune, Pluto and Orcus will never be in the same part of the sky at once and don't form conjunctions. They just happen to always stay a certain distance in separate parts of the solar system at all times. And because they have similar orbital periods, they will never catch up to each other. You'll never see in the chart Pluto and Orcus conjunct. By taking an objective and detached look at the truth inside ourselves, in our subconscious, and by allowing it to come up, we gain much insight into our full subconscious, our own underworld, so to speak, or our own Hades. The underworld, subconscious, in myths, was about purifying souls. What this means in modern times is we must go through, quote, hell, or our own underworld, subconscious, and, quote, purify our souls by waking up, learning our soul's truth, which is Orcus, and gaining our power, which is Pluto. This can be painful and very difficult, hence the references to hell and it being a negative in the different mythologies. Orcus was a god who escorted souls to the underworld. This can be seen in the idea that when we learn a hard truth about ourselves or the world, we are already on the path to the, quote, underworld, to deal with our subconscious stuff. That truth helps escort us fully into our personal underworld. Orcus has to do with the idea of confession projection, and some forms of psychological projection in general. Projection is also related to Pluto and all the subconscious planets, Plutinos, but with Orcus, our subconscious tends to, quote, confess to things in it by projecting it or them onto other people or other institutions, etc. Almost as a distraction away from our own stuff. This doesn't really happen consciously, although it can. It acts more like a Freudian slip, which is also Orcus. The idea of a Freudian slip where someone will say something when they don't mean to, it's their subconscious speaking. And when they speak the truth, it's Orcus. It's kind of Orcus punishing you, in a way, for not being honest or breaking a promise. Orcus represents part of the idea of the red pill from the film The Matrix. And I know this idea is overused way too much nowadays, but it applies here all too well, so I'm going to use it. If Neptune is the blue pill, the wool we allow to be pulled over our eyes, the red pill applies to all of the Plutinos. And with Pluto, to wake up and transform is usually more painful and dramatic, and similar to in true Hades Pluto fashion. But with Orcus, it is less dramatic, but it can be equally hard. It is just more subtle and direct. And this makes sense psychologically, because when we think about what the red pill and the blue pill are, it's staying asleep and allowing the consensus to define reality for you, which in some ways is easier, but at the same time, you give up certain things and certain freedoms. From a spiritual perspective, you become spiritually dead, so there's that. Neptune is kind of the boundaries of the main planets, and it's kind of the boundaries, the limits of, like, not consciousness, but it at that point is like where the blending happens between reality and non-reality. There's a lot more to Neptune, but basically, it's very susceptible to blue pill quality of just having, delusions and having kind of wanting something easier and having the wool pulled over your eyes, because then looking at the harder truths is too difficult. Outside of Neptune is the Plutinos, and they challenge Neptune then. So all of this that I've just been speaking about, this is the lesson and challenge of Orcus. To quote the astrologer Nick Anthony Fiorenza, quote, Pluto dramatically forces us into the underworld of our incarnate experience to confront and clear out our deepest fears and behavioral patterns, cloaking the true powers of our souls. Orcus, complementing this process, impels an authentic, emotionally detached, observant pursuit to establish conscious awareness of our soul level agreement. End quote. And that's a very wordy way of saying what I've been saying, and I think he obviously sums it up beautifully. I'm going to link to Nick Fiorenza's article on Orcus so you can go more into his thoughts on it as well down below. It's a great article. This is why Orcus is the ethical battle inside oneself. We can ignore Orcus and take the blue pill, ignoring our soul level agreements, and ultimately staying powerless over even oneself, becoming stale and asleep spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, and ultimately physically. Orcus can be lonely, it can be hard. Orcus goes against the consensus to see the truth. Consensus truth is not deeper truth. If you are running around calling out people on their deepest shit, they probably aren't going to like you too much. Depending on them, of course. But that is the kind of truth that Orcus rules, the hard truths. The ones we want to ignore, but we can't. When a person works through their Orcus stuff, then they can in turn apply that honest conviction and clarity towards the world. They can begin to call out others because they begin to see others, quote, Orcus inside themselves. They begin to see others' deep lies, and they can call them out. Orcus isn't malicious, unless heavily afflicted in the chart, but Orcus is not a malicious planet. Its intentions are not harm. Its intentions are only to punish those who break an oath. Orcus has one goal, to punish those who break oaths. Or more positively, Orcus wants us to be honest with ourselves and others, as difficult as that can be, and fully honest. In a more mundane way, Orcus represents exactly that, broken oaths and oaths in general, both legal, in the government, etc., on a literal sense. It can indicate times when the buildup of broken oaths in the collective subconscious comes out or gets punished. Many people break oaths, lie, manipulate others with ideas, or say things while knowingly meaning something else. And these things build up in institutions, in governments, in business, etc., in families even, and in social groups, anywhere. And this, going back to the mythology, points to the idea that one guy thought, oh, well, Orcus will come back in 30 to 40 years, so I can get away with it. But Orcus came back the very next day and threw him off the cliff. That's the nature of it is, we don't know, because, you can get away with lying for so long, but it always comes back to get you. You can get away with not acknowledging your truths or the collective truths for a while, but it will always come back to get you, whether it's tomorrow or in 30 years. Similar to in the way that with a Pluto transit, things are in the background, they get bad and they get bad and they get bad, but they have to get bad enough for transformation to happen. That's how Pluto works. Orcus, it's, similar in that way. By transit or in the natal chart, Orcus can bring someone into your life who sees and brings up your subconscious stuff, the truths you hide from yourself or others, and they can call you out on your lies or hold you to your word. Or it could be multiple people that come into your life and do that. Or you become that person and embody it for others. Orcus can also instill an awakening in someone, or can bring out a long-hidden truth about oneself or their life. An example could be finding out that you were adopted, later in life, when you're older. This truth has always been there, regardless of you being aware of it. It's always been the objective truth. You were adopted, but it's deep in your subconscious because it's not something that you have a memory of. but it's still true. And so when you find out that truth, it can, rock you and really challenge a lot of, your perception of the world and everything and yourself and your soul and who you are. And those are the kind of truths that we're talking about. It doesn't have to be being adopted. That's one example. It could be, finding out really intense information about, your partner is, been doing something, and it just shatters the reality, and you wake up to, and it sets you on this course to go into your subconscious, your personal hell, your personal underworld, which ultimately, from a soul spiritual perspective, is needed. I mean, it's more difficult. It makes your life harder, but it's still needed from a more spiritual soul perspective, and ultimately a satisfaction and feeling of purpose in life perspective. So with the adoption example, for example, like the transit of a planet to one's natal Orcus, or of transit Orcus to the natal chart, would bring up different types of things. And so look for both. Because it is such a slow-moving planet, it takes a few years, similar to Pluto, to do its work. It isn't just like a one and done overnight thing, but at the same time, you can get kind of hints about your Orcus, your own Orcus in your own chart, by looking at transits to your Orcus. So say the moon, Mercury, the sun. See what happens when like the sun is conjunct your Orcus. See what's going on in your life. Like see what comes up, like that, or the moon, for example, once a month. You have one, every month you have a chance to do that. Like, for example, so, or you get my point, but the idea is because we're still trying to learn about Orcus. And so it's a great way to kind of understand it in your own chart. Most people alive right now have Orcus in Gemini, Cancer, Leo, and then the young ones have Orcus in Virgo, where Orcus currently resides. To re-emphasize, Orcus is truths that you just cannot unlearn, no matter what. I want to stress that. It's the kind of truth where, like, you can learn some truths and they, you can push them away, rationalize them away. But with an Orcus truth, you can't. It hits you, and it could be coming from someone else too. I don't know if you've ever been in a position where someone says something to you and it just kind of stings, and it like, and your immediate reaction is to disagree or think they're full of shit or they're just a jerk. But that what they said sits in the back of your mind and kind of won't go away. That might be because they're hitting your Orcus. They're talking to your Orcus. They're kind of stimulating it, and it's like, what truth are they getting at that you don't want to acknowledge? And that's hard, because like, who wants to do that? But it's, with any planet you have your lessons, and this is the lesson there. And so look for those times, and like, it's people you trust, or when they really hit something that stings, and that it's not just like an emotional reaction, because they hurt your feelings. It's like they hit something deeper, and like a few days later, even it's still kind of just in the back of your mind, like, even though you're over it otherwise, it's still just there. That's an Orcus truth. And so pay attention to that, and see what it's trying to tell you. Now, real quick, someone who has Orcus prominent in their chart, who I think we're all aware of, is Donald Trump. I'm not going to get too much into it, but regardless of your views of him, he fits the astrology of Orcus, among other things, well. So he has the Sun, Uranus, and Orcus conjunct his North Node in Gemini. So there is some Uranus influence going on with his Orcus and vice versa, but even if we look at the basic negatives and positives of Orcus, we can see them both expressed in Trump, depending on your views of him. And I think that's fascinating. The archetype here is there, like, regardless of your views, regardless of how you see them, the archetype of Orcus is strongly represented in Trump's chart. I would just leave that there, but I just wanted to give an example of someone who has Orcus prominent. Not only conjunct his North Node and Sun, but it's in his 10th house as well, so it's definitely a prominent body in his chart. Briefly, to emphasize their significance, oaths are a very important part of many other myths and cultures and religions, including in the Bible and in the Quran. Reading each one of these, you can see how much they stress on the importance of breaking an oath and the importance of keeping an oath, like how harmful it is to break an oath. And you can see this across the board in many cultures. So one final thing I wanted to go over, which I find interesting about all of the Plutinos, including Orcus, is that they all return together, or within a few years of each other. So no human being will experience this in their life, but nations do. And guess which nation is experiencing these returns and it's centered around 2020? Everyone's favorite America! First, Orcus will and has returned, or I guess has now, if we're looking in the past, between 2017 and 2019. It almost got there in December of 2016, within 1 arc minute of the US natal Orcus, but then stationed retrograde, Ixion, another Plutino, will return on the US natal chart in 2021 and 2022. And then finally, we'll have our Pluto return in the US in 2022 to 2023. We are all aware of the US natal Pluto return happening. We don't need to talk about that. That's a big deal. And we can talk about that, and I'll bring that up in the Pluto video, but as astrologers, or at least interested in astrology, you've probably heard of the US Pluto return coming up soon. But to add to the importance of this time frame, the roughly 247 years of all the Plutinos, the US is purging our collective subconscious in a transformation, claiming our power, learning hard truths, and going through feelings of having a stain on the soul as a nation, which is Ixion, and forgiving ourselves and giving ourselves a second chance. The wheel of karma always comes back around, and I will tell you more about Ixion in the next planet video. Thanks for watching. Cheers.